Hey everyone, it is Monday, October 7th, and our passage for this week is Genesis 3. The fall of man and the temptation of Adam and Eve, which really ushers in the current state of things for us, the sinful world that we're in. And so this week really is about sin. It is about the short-term and long-term effects of sin. And but also in this chapter, we already have a glimmer of hope in the reality that God has already have a plan to fix what was broken by sin. So there's lots of questions that might come up in your group, things that really the Bible doesn't answer. So one of the big ones in this passage is, what's the deal with the snake? Why were Adam and Eve not surprised that a serpent was talking to them? Frankly, it could be very well be that this wasn't the first time that the serpent tried to tempt them. Who knows? Who knows what the deal was there? What we do know is that evil, Satan, is somehow personified in this serpent. And for whatever reason, Adam and Eve aren't totally just put off or put out by it. They entertain the serpent's lies and deceit and ultimately give in to their own temptation and then sin in that process. A couple things that you could talk about, even in reference, if you go look ahead to James 1:15 and 16, where James real clearly, he talks about sin and this process of sin and how we can fall into sin and through temptation like Adam and Eve did. James says, and probably even thinking of this passage in Genesis, he says, verse 14 and 15. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So there's a direct relationship between temptation and sin, although temptation isn't in and of itself a sin. Jesus was tempted, but he resisted that temptation. That's another place you could go, actually, come to think of it, as Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness, and where Adam and Eve gave into the temptation of the evil one and the liar. Jesus did not, and he overcame that. There's some parallels there, even in that Matthew 4 passage. So that could be a cool place that you want to go look to as well, and to see how Jesus fills those things and does not give into temptation. And in doing so, proves himself to be the one who can be our representative in salvation, where Adam is our representative in sin, and Jesus is representative in salvation, which is what Paul talks about in Romans. So back to Genesis 3, we have, I encourage you to kind of take a look and even dissect a little bit the process of temptation that Satan uses, that the serpent uses, kind of twisting God's words, making out God to be someone who's withholding, who's not giving all of the information. And then how can we relate to that? Are there ways that there are lies that we kind of buy into about God particularly? And how can we see that those lies contradict the God of the Bible, the God that the Bible reveals to us? I think what we see a lot of times is, in the process of temptation, the character of God is attacked. Talk about that. That's a great thing to discuss. You know, how in this, when we're tempted, what's the underlying attack on God's character? What's being said about him, whether overtly or covertly? And then how does James speak to this process of sin and temptation like Genesis 3 does? Talk about the immediate consequences of sin, the long-term consequences of sin. Certainly there's relational dynamics that are destroyed and distorted between the man and the woman, between man and God, between man and creation, man and the earth. I mean, everything is disrupted. But God doesn't destroy it all. In fact, in that Genesis 3 curse, there is what theologians have called the proto-evangelion, which is a fancy Greek way of saying it's like the first gospel proclamation. It's the first hint. Even in Genesis 3, it's the first hint of Jesus. Of course, the name of Jesus isn't named, but he is the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent. So there's still hope in the midst of just this horrific occasion of sin entering the world. And it would be very appropriate to even spend a little bit of time just in lament. And what I mean by that is just sadness. It could be that you want to end your night just kind of on a downer, if it seems appropriate, and pray just like together, admitting either specific or just general sin that exists in the world, and lamenting the fact that we would have done the same, that the same temptation that came against Adam and Eve comes against us now, and we are equally unable to resist that temptation at plenty of times. So that would be a real appropriate way to end that. Or even if you want to, finish out your time together in your check-in groups, sort of in that spirit of mutual discipleship, where you're breaking people into groups of 2 or 3. Maybe you're even at a point where you can kind of confess some sins to one another. And so you be the guides in that process with your groups. But let me know if you have questions or thoughts about Genesis 3, and I hope you guys have a great week and a good time in your life groups. We'll see you.